He walked into that company believing he would finally have a real chance, but all he received were crooked looks, veiled comments, and the same sentence repeated every time he tried to prove his worth. "You're good for nothing." On that day, the boss humiliated him in a way that would make anyone give up. But what no one imagined is that just hours later, when a massive problem threatened to bring the entire company down, the very man they most underestimated would be the only one capable of saving everything. And what he discovered, and what he did, became a story that many people still try to understand to this day. So stay until the end, because you're going to be surprised by what really happened. And when you finish, make sure to subscribe to the channel, drop a like, and comment what you thought of this video, because this story deserves to be heard.
The boss stared at Lucas with a hard gaze, laden with that silent contempt he had recognized from early on. A contempt that didn't need words to wound. But that day, the words came. Cruel, direct, heavy. "You're good for nothing." The phrase struck like a sentence, as if decreeing the fate of a man who had spent his whole life fighting against closed doors and glances that questioned his ability before even hearing his voice. The air around seemed to thicken, as if even the silence were complicit in that humiliation. Colleagues averted their eyes, some out of cowardice, others out of discomfort. But all, however, accepting the scene as something almost expected. Lucas felt the internal impact, that familiar blow so many black people know, the one of automatic devaluation, the judgment that precedes any gesture, any competence, any story. It was an old pain, inherited and lived, accumulating in invisible layers over the years. But he did not look away. He did not blink. There was something different about him that day. Perhaps fatigue, perhaps courage, perhaps the quiet certainty of someone who can no longer endure being diminished to fit someone else's prejudice. Because deep down, despite the pain, he knew. No one had the right to measure his worth based on their own ignorance. No one had the right to shape his identity through insults that only revealed the moral poverty of the person uttering them. Lucas took a deep breath, and it came steady, as if within him there were a voice older than that boss, stronger than that room, truer than any offense. "I know who I am." And in that instant, even without saying a word, he broke the ancestral cycle that tries to normalize what should never have existed. The habit of accepting cruelty disguised as authority as one's fate. When he returned to his desk, he walked as if carrying the strength of generations on his back. Each step bore the weight of recent pain, but also the firmness of someone carrying a history that did not begin there. He sat, breathed deeply, and let the air fill the void that the attack had tried to open. Then, within his own mind, he heard the echoes of childhood, his mother telling him he was capable, that the world would try to diminish his light, but that he had enough to shine through any shadow. His grandfather reminding him, with that wise and weary look, that in society they would always have to be twice as good to receive the basics: respect, recognition, humanity. These memories always accompanied him, like small internal beacons that ignite in the darkest moments. They were the fuel that kept his light burning, even when they tried to extinguish it, when biased glances and cutting remarks tried to infiltrate his self-esteem like silent cracks. He wouldn't let that phrase become true. Not now, not after everything his family had faced, not after all the effort it had taken to get where he was. Deep down, he knew that, more often than not, criticisms like that didn't reflect reality. They reflected the veiled racism lurking in corporate environments, the kind of prejudice rarely admitted but evident in microaggressions, lowered expectations, and snap judgments that try to turn confidence into doubt. But Lucas was stronger than doubt. He was made of resilience, of ancestral stubbornness, of dreams that survive even when the world tries to crush them. And as he adjusted his chair and stared at the screen in front of him, he felt that, despite the wound still fresh, there was something inside him that no cruel phrase could take away. The certainty of his own worth. The company was on the brink of collapse, and everyone there knew it, including the boss who wandered the hallways like a panicked captain trying to save a ship he himself had sunk. Instead of taking responsibility or seeking real solutions, He seemed more concerned with finding someone to blame, as if pointing fingers could patch financial holes or reorganize the mess that had been piling up for months. And, as often happens, his finger landed on the easiest target, the one employee he had never seen as part of the company's future. Lucas had always felt it, that sense of being tolerated but never truly considered, of being noticed only when something went wrong, never when it went right. But the difference that day was that Lucas no longer carried the same willingness to shrink in the face of injustice. With a calm forged over years of silent battles, microaggressions disguised as feedback, and unequal expectations, he realized something important. If there was ever a perfect moment to turn underestimation into victory, that moment was now. The chaos around him, the team's desperation, the almost tangible tension in the air, none of it shook him. On the contrary, it ignited a state of absolute focus. It was as if all the lessons of life, all the conversations with his family, all the times he had to prove his competence before even getting the chance to show it, converged in that instant. Because when the world tries to push a black person down, sometimes it's precisely that push that creates the power to rise. Pressure becomes propulsion. Other people's doubt, ironically, awakens inner certainty. Lucas straightened his posture, opened reports, reviewed data, connected dots no one else saw, and while the boss wasted energy looking for a scapegoat, he silently built the solution that could save everyone. And in that nearly imperceptible movement, Lucas made it clear, even if no one had noticed yet, that neither the company's collapse nor the limited vision of a leader adrift would define his value. Lucas spent hours analyzing spreadsheets, reports, and old files. His eyes scanned numbers like someone reading a language few truly understood. He compared. He analyzed the data, cross-referenced information, reviewed decisions made months earlier. He noticed details no one else had. The small inconsistencies, strange repetitions, values that subtly drifted from the expected curve. He knew that racism sometimes manifested in this way too, when the quiet work of people like him was ignored, when their effort was assumed to be ordinary, invisible, or disposable. How many times had he done double the work just to be recognized for half? How many times had his solutions been credited to chance, while his mistakes were treated as personal tragedies? Thinking about it, rather than weakening him, fueled a stubborn strength within him. It was as if every accumulated injustice had been converted into fuel. While others wasted time hunting for someone to blame, mired in unproductive arguments and poorly concealed fears, Lucas searched for patterns. Not because he wanted to prove something to anyone, but because he knew results spoke louder than any prejudice. And because this was how he had always won, by showing what many failed to see, noticing what others merely glanced past. And then he found it. A financial error repeated month after month, quietly draining resources, eroding the budget like a silent leak. It was so obvious that it seemed impossible no one had seen it before. The figures were there, screaming for anyone willing to truly look. But Lucas knew that the obvious is only visible to those who look with intention, and many at the top only look upward, at positions, status, at those who resemble themselves. They rarely look to the side, where those who actually hold the foundation stand. With the cursor blinking on the screen and the discovery before his eyes, Lucas felt something rise within him. Not relief, but purpose. He had found the key to the problem. And as has happened so many times throughout history, it was the strength of someone underestimated that was about to prevent the collapse caused by others. As he grasped the magnitude of the discovery, his heart raced. It wasn't just a trivial error, one any analyst could have found with enough time and attention. It was concrete proof that the problem had been there all along, quietly corroding the company, while everyone looked for someone to blame instead of seeking the root cause. It was evidence that the collapse had never been about an employee's incompetence, least of all his, but about the blindness of those who refused to see. More than that, it was proof that he, precisely he, the underestimated man, the employee constantly sidelined, had saved the company before anyone even noticed. For a few minutes, Lucas stood frozen, staring at the screen as if, beyond the lines of numbers, he could see the entire journey that had brought him there. He knew exactly the weight of handing that report to the same boss who had humiliated him hours earlier. He knew the discomfort it would cause, the rupture of the narrative, the shock of realizing that the useless one, the boss's words, was, in fact, the only person capable of finding the error everyone else had ignored. He knew what it meant to be the one responsible for the solution everyone was searching for. An immense victory, not just personal, but symbolic, because in that moment, he carried more than his own story. He carried the story of every black person who had ever been disbelieved, diminished, pushed out of the center despite their talent, their effort, their intelligence. The silence around him seemed to demand a decision, and after taking a deep breath, Lucas did what had always guided his life, even when the world insisted on testing him. He chose to do what was right. Not for recognition, not to prove anything to his boss, but because doing the right thing had always been a form of resistance for him, a way to remain whole in an environment that so often tried to break him. And while saving the company that didn't value him, Lucas was also quietly writing the version of his own story that no one else could deny. With the report nearly finished, Lucas felt a mix of nervousness and excitement he rarely experienced. It was as if two opposing forces were tugging at his chest. On one side, the deep satisfaction of knowing he had uncovered something significant. On the other, the lingering shadow of the words that still burned like an open wound. He knew that if he presented it, there would be no denying his worth. Not this time. Not with numbers so clear. Not with a solution so precise. But the pain of what he had heard from his boss still echoed in his mind, a persistent reminder that competence alone is not always enough to dismantle prejudice. Lucas knew, with the clarity of someone who had lived it many times, that workplace racism rarely came in the form of explicit insults. Often, it appeared more subtly, and therefore more cruelly. It was in the constant suspicion, in the need to prove and reaffirm his ability every single day. It was in the lack of recognition, in praise that never arrived, in promotions that always slipped away as if destined for others, but never for him. It was in the intense scrutiny of his mistakes and the indifference to his successes. These wounds left no visible marks, but they built internal scars that he carried in silence. That was why he hesitated for a few minutes. Presenting that report meant delivering a massive solution into the hands of someone who, just hours earlier, had tried to diminish his existence. It was like offering a bridge to someone who had tried to knock him down. It was not a simple decision. Yet, at the same time, Lucas knew that his actions could not be shaped by the limitations of others. His character did not depend on his boss. His greatness did not depend on anyone else's recognition. And his intelligence, that silent strength that so many had tried to ignore, could not be hidden simply because the world insisted on underestimating people like him. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and found within himself the courage that so many generations before him had had to cultivate to pass through doors that were never meant to open. And so, with his dignity intact and his sense of purpose even stronger, he decided he would reveal the truth in the right way for the right reason. Because in the end, his story would not be written by those who sought to diminish him, but by the person he chose to be. He decided he would not let anyone's prejudice extinguish his light. The pain was still there, throbbing like a recent reminder, but it no longer had the power to control his steps. Lucas straightened his posture, opened the file in front of him, and began organizing everything into a clear, precise, indisputable presentation. He worked like a meticulous craftsman, reviewing every graph, polishing every sentence, adjusting every explanation until the whole formed not just a report, but an irrefutable narrative. He transformed cold numbers into solid arguments, into a line of reasoning so transparent that anyone, even those who had never truly seen him, would have to face the truth. He had always believed that excellence was his greatest weapon, not out of vanity, not to flaunt competence, and certainly not to bear the unjust weight of representing all those like him. It was because he knew excellence opens doors that many try to keep closed for black bodies, doors that often only open when there is no other option but to recognize it. And so, guided by the responsibility he felt, not just for himself, but for all those who had come before him and had to prove twice as much to receive half, Lucas finalized the presentation. He saved the file with a click that felt almost symbolic, as if closing one chapter of his life and opening another. Leaning back in his chair and taking a deep breath, he felt a force grow within him, deep, warm, ancestral. It was not arrogance. It was belonging. It was the feeling of being aligned with the history that preceded him, as if invisible arms supported him, as if ancient voices whispered courage in his ear. And in that moment, he heard something within himself that did not come from fear, doubt, or pain. It came from a place far more solid, far more true. I am capable. I have always been capable, and now no one can ignore it. It was more than an affirmation. It was a pact with himself, a declaration of existence, dignity, and power. The next morning, walking through the hallways, Lucas felt the curious eyes of his colleagues. Some knew about the humiliating scolding the boss had given him the day before. Those were the same people who had watched the scene in silence, looking away to avoid facing the injustice. Others were simply uneasy about the crisis hanging over everyone, the feeling that the entire company was on the verge of collapse. Every glance carried something: guilt, curiosity, fear, expectation. But Lucas walked with steadiness, with dignity, as he had always learned to do, even when the world seemed to want to shrink his presence. There was a posture in his body, a posture that was not arrogance, but ancestry, a way of existing that said, even without words, I belong in this space, regardless of what they try to make me believe. He knocked on the boss's door, feeling the tense energy of the room even before entering. The man was there, seated behind his desk, but he seemed smaller than the day before, exhausted, lost, almost defeated, like someone who finally realized they no longer had control over the chaos they had helped create. I need to show you something, Lucas said, his voice firm but respectful. There was no arrogance, no submission. It was simply the truth, spoken with the strength of someone who knows themselves. The boss raised his eyes in surprise, perhaps recalling the cruel phrase he had uttered the day before. For a moment, his expression, so hard, so self-assured the day prior, wavered. There was a mix of guilt and embarrassment, perhaps a hint of recognition, perhaps just fear of the consequences. Yet he allowed Lucas to enter. And when Lucas crossed that threshold, he was not merely carrying a report in his hand, he was carrying an entire story on his shoulders, his own, his family's, the story of every person who had ever had to confront prejudice to prove once again what had always been obvious: competence has no color. As Lucas began to explain, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The room, previously heavy with tension and uncertainty, transformed into a space where every word carried weight, every piece of data seemed to resonate, every gesture of his bore the firmness of someone who knew exactly what they were talking about. The boss followed each slide with wide eyes, as if seeing the company for the first time. Each number increased his disbelief. Each analysis dismantled months of mistakes. Every solution presented by Lucas seemed to ignite a new light, and with it, an unbearable sense of shame. It was impossible to deny. Lucas had found the problem that no one, absolutely no one, had been able to identify. And more than that, he had structured a solution that was clear, practical, and effective. He had not only pointed out the gap, he showed the way to fix it. During the presentation, several moments of silence arose. But these were not silences of disinterest or boredom. They were silences of impact. Silences in which the boss blinked slowly, trying to digest the information. Silences of belated recognition, the kind that shatter internal narratives and force a person to confront the truth they had always tried to ignore. The boss finally understood, perhaps for the first time, that the employee he had humiliated the day before was, in fact, the only one capable of saving the company. It was impossible to mask that shock. He swallowed hard more than once, leaned forward, resting his elbow on the desk as if trying to anchor himself to something solid. And as Lucas presented, he felt something different arise within him. It was not revenge. It was not empty pride. It was a profound sense of justice. For the first time, his truth, his worth, his intelligence, his voice was being heard, truly heard. Not because he shouted, not because he asserted himself, but because in the face of excellence, even prejudice loses its power. And in that moment, as the final slide appeared on the screen, Lucas understood something that would change his life forever. No cruel phrase could erase what he had always carried within himself. At the end of the presentation, the boss remained silent for long seconds. It was not an ordinary silence. It was a heavy, almost uncomfortable silence. The kind that arises when reality finally breaks through the bubble of ignorance. He stared at the screen as if trying to process the fact that all of this, the salvation of the company, the solution that would prevent a corporate disaster, had come from the very person he had humiliated so easily the day before. Lucas watched the scene, not with arrogance, but with serenity. His eyes bore no revenge, only truth. He knew that this moment was bigger than an apology or a sudden change of expression. It was about years of structural racism that had accompanied him from the start of his career, about being the only black person in the room, often the only one on the entire team, about being constantly tested, evaluated, questioned, while others received automatic trust simply for existing in the right place, with the right face. It was about all the energy spent proving the obvious, that he was capable, very capable. Capable enough to achieve whatever he wanted, even if the world tried to convince him otherwise. The boss finally exhaled deeply, removed his glasses with trembling hands, and let slip, almost in a whisper. "Lucas, I had no idea." But Lucas already knew. He always knew. Many times those who carry prejudice do not even realize it, because they are used to seeing the world from only one perspective, their own. They are accustomed to a comfort zone where they never have to ask themselves if they are being unjust, if they are being violent, if they are reproducing what should never have been considered normal. Still, Lucas maintained his posture. Shoulders squared, gaze steady, breath calm. Because his dignity had never depended on belated recognition. His strength did not come from what others said about him, but from what he knew to be true. And in that instant, even before a boss humbled by his own error, Lucas understood. It was not him who needed that recognition. It was the entire company, the corporate world, society itself. He was simply continuing to be who he had always been. Excellent, upright, unshakable. The truth at last had found its place, and Lucas, for the first time, felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be. In light of the gravity of the discovery, the entire board was summoned. The meeting room, vast and formal, was filled with executives who, until that moment, barely knew Lucas's name. But now, faced with indisputable numbers and a solution so clear it seemed to shine on its own, everyone paid attention as if every word he spoke were gold. The atmosphere was tense, charged with expectation and disbelief. Gazes crossed, whispers were interrupted, pens hovered in the air. And at the center of it all, Lucas remained steady, articulate, confident. There was no hesitation, no desire to please. He knew this was his moment, not because anyone had granted it, but because he had earned it through work, patience, and intelligence. At the end of his explanation, one of the directors, still surprised, asked how no one had noticed it before. Lucas lifted his eyes, serene, and answered with a calmness that carried firmness. "I only found it because I revisited the basics. Sometimes the problem is right in front of us." He didn't need to say more. The phrase carried more than technical explanation. It carried reflection, critique, and truth. Everyone understood what he meant, including the boss, who lowered his head, silent, realizing the symbolic weight of that sentence and the irony of his own failure. In that moment, Lucas did more than save the company from an imminent disaster. He also exposed, unequivocally, a much deeper and larger flaw: the inability to see value where prejudice tends to create blindness. Without aggression, without humiliation, with absolute clarity, he showed that excellence and dedication cannot be ignored, and that any attempt to do so is, ultimately, a limitation of those who refuse to look with fairness. Lucas left the meeting not just respected, but recognized for what he had always been: someone whose competence transcends any judgment based on color, prejudice, or narrow vision. For the first time, his presence and worth were undeniable because they did not require approval, only true attention. Soon after, the room erupted with thanks, handshakes, and compliments. People who had rarely noticed him now extended their hands, smiled, tried to start conversations, wanted his opinion on everything, as if suddenly Lucas had become indispensable in everyone's eyes. It was almost surreal. The change in the environment was palpable. Nervous laughter, admiring glances, murmurs of acknowledgement. But Lucas knew that, although receiving recognition felt good, he could not let it change who he was. He could not allow sudden validation to seduce him or make him forget the journey that had brought him there. He knew exactly what he had faced to reach that moment. He remembered the long nights alone in the office, reviewing reports and cross-referencing data while most had already gone home. Though, he remembered the unjust decisions that had tried to undermine his confidence, the opportunities denied to him that others received effortlessly, the skeptical looks whenever he dared to present an idea. Above all, he knew the weight of being a black man in an environment where few seemed willing to believe in his ability. Every step, every achievement had to be earned on ground mined with distrust and the silent prejudice that hid behind corporate norms and empty words. So, despite the compliments and sudden admiration, Lucas remained centered. He kept his posture, his steady gaze, and the serenity that had always defined him. Because his victory was not only professional, it was also a victory against the silent prejudice that had been imposed on him. It was proof that competence, resilience, and integrity could not be erased by bias, and that true recognition comes from merit and truth, not from fear or convenience. And in that moment, Lucas smiled to himself, not out of pride, but out of awareness. He had won. He had overcome the challenge, the injustice, the blindness of others. And above all, he had remained whole, true to who he had always been. When the meeting ended, the boss asked to speak with him privately. Lucas entered the room calmly, with firm steps and upright posture. There was no resentment, but there was firmness. The firmness of someone who had learned to stand their ground without losing respect, of someone who knows their worth and does not need to prove it to anyone, only to themselves. The boss, visibly embarrassed, avoided direct eye contact for a few moments before finally speaking sincerely. "I was unfair, and I treated you in a way you did not deserve. You saved the company, and I needed all of this to realize how wrong I was." Lucas listened attentively. There was no rush, no urgency to respond, because he knew that hearing a genuine apology did not diminish his strength. On the contrary, it enhanced it. Recognizing another's mistake while remaining upright is a gesture of silent power, and Lucas understood this very clearly. After a few seconds, he replied calmly, without raising his voice. "I don't want you to recognize my worth only today. I want you to recognize it always. Not just mine, but anyone's who dedicates themselves, regardless of appearance, skin color, or background. That is the minimum." The boss nodded, head down, ashamed. It was not only the awareness of his mistake, but the weight of truth before him, the reality that talent and dedication should never be judged by silent prejudice or hasty judgments. And in that moment, Lucas realized something greater than corrected numbers or completed reports. More than saving the company, he had sparked a human change. A step, small but significant, toward a fairer environment. He had shown that leadership is not just power over spreadsheets or targets, but the ability to transform attitudes and create space so that fairness and recognition are not privileges for a few, but rights for all. And as he left the room, Lucas carried with him the certainty that his work transcended financial results. He had done something greater. He had left a mark of integrity, courage, and dignity that no one could erase. Hours later, the news spread throughout the entire company. Lucas would be promoted to a leadership position. It was not a symbolic gesture, nor an attempt to repair past mistakes. It was genuine recognition of his competence, his tireless dedication, and the solution that had saved the company from an imminent collapse. Many colleagues celebrated, smiling and congratulating him enthusiastically. Some were surprised, unable to believe that the man who had always been underestimated was finally receiving the place he deserved. Others remained silent, perhaps because, for the first time, they realized they had misjudged someone who had always been one step ahead. For Lucas, however, The greatest reward was not the position or the title he would now hold. It was the deep sense that, despite the barriers, he had continued to believe in himself. It was the certainty that racism, silent or explicit, constant or hidden, had not been able to stop his intelligence, his focus, or his ability to turn difficulty into opportunity. It was the understanding that this day symbolized something greater. He had not only saved the company, he had also preserved his own confidence, reaffirmed his story, and demonstrated silently but irrefutably that no one has the right to dictate what a black person can or cannot achieve. In that moment, Lucas felt a mixture of relief, pride, and serenity. Every challenge he had faced, every skeptical look, every denied opportunity throughout his career converged in that instant, and he knew with absolute clarity that his path could never be defined by the prejudice of others. He had earned more than a position. He had earned justice for himself and shown the world that excellence, courage, and dignity know no color. In the days that followed, Lucas began taking on his new responsibilities, and something remarkable happened. People who had once barely greeted him now sought his advice, validated decisions with him, or simply watched how he analyzed complex problems with clarity and precision. Those same colleagues who had doubted his abilities, ignored him, or underestimated him, now had to acknowledge his competence. He noticed the changes around him, but he also noticed something even greater changing within him. For the first time, he felt that he was not just occupying a leadership position, he was paving the way for others who would come after him. For black people who are so often excluded from positions of prominence, rendered invisible, or considered incapable before even having the chance to show their talent. Lucas was fully aware of this, and that awareness gave him a sense of mission that transcended any corporate title or formal authority. He wanted to be competent, yes, but not just for his own merit. He wanted to be a reference. He wanted to be an inspiration. He wanted to be living proof that excellence has no color, that talent is not measured by appearance, and that prejudice, no matter how deep-rooted or silent, cannot withstand the determination of someone who refuses to be limited by the judgment of others. And as he walked through the company's corridors, now with a new quiet respect emanating from every gesture of his colleagues, Lucas felt something that went far beyond recognition. He felt the responsibility of representing all those who had come before him and all those who would come after. Not as an obligation, but as a legacy of competence, dignity, and resilience that no one could ever erase. With every decision he made, with every guidance he offered, he knew. This was not just about leading a company. It was about leading by example, showing that talent, courage, and integrity can indeed break barriers and open doors to a fairer future. One morning, while walking to the office, Lucas received a message from his mother. She wrote with the simplicity and wisdom of someone who knows every battle her son has faced. "My son, I am proud. You have triumphed without needing to diminish anyone. Your light has always been there. They just took time to see it." Reading those words, his eyes filled with silent tears, not of sadness, but of profound gratitude. Gratitude for having a family who always believed in him, even when the world tried to convince him otherwise. Gratitude for every obstacle that strengthened him, every long night of dedication, every moment he had to resist skeptical looks and unfair words. Gratitude even for the injustices, which, though painful, forged in him the courage to continue, to assert himself, and to remain whole. He knew with clarity that historically black people bear the weight of having to prove, and prove again. That excellence, so often, is not enough to have their value recognized automatically. But Lucas also knew something even more important. Each achievement, each demonstration of competence and resilience, opened a crack in the rigid structure of prejudice, and he wanted to widen that crack. He wanted to make doors accessible for those who would come after, for all who would face the same barriers and need living examples of resistance and dignity. Lucas put his phone in his pocket and entered the company with a subtle yet confident smile. It was not empty pride, nor fleeting satisfaction. It was the serenity of someone who finally recognizes their own power. The power to exist fully, to transform pain into strength, to lead without fear, to open paths with integrity. And as he walked through the corridors, he felt that each step carried not only his own story, but the story of all those who had come before him and all those who would come after. A silent, steadfast, unshakable presence that no one could ever ignore. When he entered the conference room, everyone noticed something different about him. It was not arrogance, nor a desire for revenge. It was presence. The kind of presence that only emerges when someone has spent their entire life being underestimated, ignored, and yet prevails. A presence that demands attention without begging for it. Lucas moved to the center of the room and began presenting his ideas with a clarity and precision that silenced everyone. Every argument was solid, every number carefully analyzed. Every proposal carried not only technical knowledge but real experience, that experience born from years of dedication, long nights, and challenges faced in silence. The same boss who had ridiculed him weeks earlier now tried to mask his discomfort. He leaned forward, adjusted his tie, rested his elbows on the table, small gestures of someone who, belatedly, realized he had underestimated someone. Lucas, however, did not care. He was not there to prove anything to anyone. He did not need to. He had always been capable, always ready, just never seen. And in that moment, before all those attentive eyes, before every colleague surprised by the strength of his analysis, the truth became irrefutable. Competence cannot be erased by prejudice, talent cannot be hidden by disdain, and value does not need permission to exist. Lucas demonstrated, silently but unmistakably, that victory does not need to be announced with arrogance. It was already there, obvious, undeniable, impossible to ignore. And finally, everyone could see what had always been right in front of them. When he finished the presentation, the room erupted in applause. It was not ceremonial, mechanical, or forced. It was genuine, almost emotional, as if each person present had just witnessed something rare and transformative. Some employees whispered among themselves, remarking that they had never seen anything so complete, so brilliant, so indispensable. The company director rose, his firm steps echoing in the silent room, and walked over to Lucas. Before everyone, with the solemnity the moment demanded, he declared that this strategy would not only solve the problem, but save the company from a multi-million-dollar loss. Each word reverberated through the room, full of recognition and admiration. Meanwhile, the expression on the face of the boss who had humiliated him weeks earlier was a perfect portrait of life's irony. The man who had tried to diminish him, disqualify his ideas, and humiliate his presence, now depended on that very same employee to keep his own job and save his reputation. His discomfort was visible, and the sense of silent justice was almost palpable. Lucas took a deep breath, feeling a restrained, serene, silent pride. It was not pride in being better than someone, nor satisfaction from a personal victory. It was the calm of finally being seen for what he had always been: competent, integral, brilliant. At last, the world, or at least that room full of executives, could clearly see who he had always been. And in that moment, Lucas realized something even deeper. True victory was not only in saving the company, it was in affirming, with dignity, that talent, dedication, and courage cannot be denied, not by cruel words, nor by prejudice, nor by the blindness of others. Recognition had arrived, and it was finally unavoidable. As he left the company that day, Lucas noticed something simple yet profound. The sky seemed bluer. There was a lightness in the air, a sense that, at last, everything made sense. He understood that he did not need to prove his worth to those who refused to see. His strength did not depend on anyone else's approval. He only needed to keep growing, building, advancing, and remaining faithful to his own excellence and integrity. Life, sooner or later, delivers justice to those who act with truth. And indeed, what began as humiliation, disdain, and underestimation ended as transformation, not just of the company, but of everyone around him, and above all, of himself. He, a young black man so often disbelieved, invisibilized, questioned even before speaking, became the pillar who saved an entire corporation in just one day. And his story carries a message that resonates strongly for anyone willing to listen. If someone tries to diminish you, do not step back. Shine. If they try to erase your presence, do not hide. Talent, courage, and character always find a way to ignite their own light. And when that light finally emerges, No matter how great the obstacles, how entrenched the prejudice, how skeptical the eyes watching, no one can extinguish it. Lucas walked through the streets feeling the calm certainty of someone who knows their own worth, who understands that every challenge faced served to strengthen him. Every doubt cast upon him was fuel, and every achievement, no matter how small it seemed to others, carried the weight of silent justice. He knew that this light was not only his, it was a bridge for all those who would come after, a beacon proving that competence, courage, and dignity cannot be ignored and will never be extinguished.